Hi everyone, I'm Jesse Lynn.
And I'm Angela Lynn. Welcome back to another episode of But Where Are You Really From? If you're watching the video, you can tell that we have a special guest with us today. We're super excited to invite Jocelyn Chung on the show. Welcome! Thanks for
Yay!
joining
Thanks for
us.
having me.
Yeah. So actually, Jocelyn made a funny joke before we were online. She said something like she felt like she was meeting celebrities when we actually connected because she listened to some of our episodes. But honestly, I'm like, I think we're kind of meeting a celebrity because we've been following you on Instagram for a while
Oh,
now.
really?
So for me, I'm like, wait, you're the celebrity. Some of you might know Jocelyn from Instagram. She's been quite open with sharing many different aspects of her life, including her work, obviously, illustration, writing, but also moving to Taiwan and a lot of that journey. So we have a lot of things to talk about today for sure. But one of the most exciting things that we want to share with everyone is that her book, When Love is More Than Words, is out now.
Yay!
So we are going to talk a lot about that today. But before we get into it all, some people don't know who you are yet. So we want to give you the chance to intro yourself and also lump in whatever answer you have for the question, but where are you really from?
Wow, thanks for that very generous introduction. My name is Jocelyn Chung. I am a graphic designer and a first-time author. I am born and raised in Southern California, which is where I am from, as well as my parents are both immigrants from Taiwan. My mom is originally from Kaohsiung, and then my dad is from Yilan. And then my grandparents' families were in Jiayi for a long time. So that is where I am from and a little bit about me.
Very cool that your family is kind of from all different parts of Taiwan, because I feel like a lot of times our answers are usually like, oh, they're from Taipei or like one specific part. So it's cool to hear it's all kind of scattered. So let's jump into Taiwan first, since you already mentioned all that. So you've been sharing a lot on Instagram about your journey of it's not reclaiming, you claimed, right, your Taiwanese citizenship. So what inspired that whole journey and how did that all go?
That's a question a lot of people ask. They're like, how long have you wanted to do this? Or like, why go back? Yeah, I have always wanted to live in Taiwan ever since I was young. I have a lot of family and extended family in Southern California. However, I feel like I grew up with like Taiwanese lore of like the homeland. And actually, the first time that I went to Taiwan wasn't until I was 20. So it was quite later in life. A lot of that was because financially, like my family couldn't afford to go to Taiwan growing up. Although, like all my other cousins, they would go like every year, do that annual trip thing. But for me, it was really because like majority of my family are all in Southern California now, at least extended family. Both sets of grandparents immigrated over, so there wasn't really like a need to go. And so I think that growing up with this like idealized, romanticized, almost fairy tale like view of Taiwan, there was like a really strong desire to want to go and discover it for myself and understand more of like my background, where I came from, where my family is from. The first time I went there when I was 20, I left with like this longing and like hunger to go back and stay for a longer time. I was going to study abroad there. And then I think only like a few students like signed up for Taiwan study abroad. So they canceled it. And then so this like dream kind of like slipped out of my hands again. And then I was going to go right before the pandemic. And then the pandemic hit. And so basically, once the pandemic had cleared, when things had aligned in my personal life, I was like, all right, this is time for me to go. And first, I decided to go for a few months. So I just went and lived there for 3 months, came back and was like, okay, I want to live for a longer time. So in total, I think I've lived there for about a little over a year. During that time was also when I decided, okay, like, I'm kind of done with the US. Not a big fan of a lot of the things that are going on here. And I think, like, safety wise, obviously America has its complexities. And so I really started to build like a community in Taiwan while I was there and really saw that, wow, I could really live my life here. I could see living here long term. I could see raising a family here. And so decided to go through the process of getting my Taiwanese citizenship. And at the same time, actually, my sister regained her citizenship because she was born in Taiwan. And then my mom also, when she had like forfeited her citizenship when she immigrated, but she also like went and regained her citizenship. So this domino effect kind of happened in my family where a lot of my family members are now picturing living back in Taiwan, retiring in Taiwan, spending half time. And so, yeah, that's a little bit about my journey, why I decided to go get my citizenship. But yeah, my hope is to move there long term, like in the next few years. So, yeah.
That's awesome. You mentioned this lore. You had said before this is like family stories of growing up there, or what does that look and sound like?
Yeah, family stories for sure. A lot of like childhood stories, right? That our parents, I think, like, especially for a lot of our parents who've immigrated in like the 80s, 90s, I think a lot of the reason why they might have come maybe wasn't 100% their personal wanting to come. At least for my family, that was how it was, like politically, right? Like everything happened with the US then recognizing China. And so then there was a lot of tensions. And at least with my family, they felt like it was no longer safe to stay in Taiwan. And so they decided, okay, like through chain migration, I had an uncle who was like studying here. They decided to come over, but my mom herself like didn't want to leave. Actually, her parents first went, and she was in college at the time, and they were like, okay, we've decided to move here. So she decided like, well, okay, well, my parents are there, so I have to go. So she came at 20. And so I think that there's this longing and lore, that fairy tale like quality of Taiwan that they would pass on to me. Growing up in a dairy farm in Jiayi, they primarily served milk to Japanese soldiers and like government officials because Taiwanese people historically don't drink milk because lactose. But like the Japanese people loved milk, and so all these dairy farms started sprouting up, especially in like southern Taiwan. And so my family was among those who were providing dairy and milk and beef, all these things that were a little bit more historically more foreign to Taiwan for Japanese soldiers. So I think I heard a lot of stories of mango trees, dairy farm, the chickens running, Japanese beetles flying around, like tying strings to them, flying them like kites, things like that. So I think that they fed this almost like rosy, glassy view of like what this like ancient Taiwan of their youth looked like, but not necessarily like a present day living, breathing place, because they had also been disconnected from it.
That's so interesting because it seems like there's like an oral history for your family almost, because a lot of them moved here. But I think like for my family, not everybody is here. And I feel like growing up, my parents did have anecdotes about childhood and stuff, but I don't think there was like a huge lore around that.
No, we didn't have as much lore. I mean, the way you described it does sound so magical. I'm like, wait, is there like a Julie Andrews like around in some fields right now? No, that sounds magical to me too. I think it does highlight that Taiwan is a lot more diverse than a lot of us believe it to be, especially because so many people, when they think Taiwan, really think of Taipei specifically, but Taiwan is so much more than that. And at least for me, I feel like I don't know that much about Taiwan outside of like a few specific cities. So even your description of that side of Taiwan, I'm like, I didn't even know that existed. So if I had grown up with those kinds of stories, I also would be like,
It was like this magical land with mango groves. I was like, I gotta go.
Yeah. And actually you mentioned something that it like stuck out to me when I read your book, is that the Japanese influence, because I noticed that one of the lines that you said was one of your grandpas would always tell you, "Ganbatte," right? So your story of trying to move to Taiwan also resonates with me because my husband and I are trying to move to Japan, actually. So we had been doing the remote life for the last several years and have spent like about a year in total in Japan in the last 2 years. So that all like definitely,
Wow.
I was like, oh, that stands out to me a little bit. And also it reminds me of like my grandma. She apparently spoke like fluent Japanese when she was a child as well. And so there's just so much of this kind of like intermingling of culture. So it's kind of cool to hear that your family has like a more direct tie with all of that in more recent times, because I think a lot of that is kind of like, oh, there's something about Japan with Taiwanese culture, but not many people have as direct of like a line to that.
Right.
So.
I think it's like lingering influences whenever you go to Taiwan, but especially if you go to the south, I feel like a lot of those influences are around. Like if you go to Tainan, there's like these really bright orange trees that are everywhere. They're there because literally the Japanese people just came in and they were like, oh, like these trees look like phoenixes, or like they look like they're on fire. And like there's a lot of these roundabouts in Tainan too. So like even like city planning, literal trees that have been planted there, like you can see the influences here and there. I say don't discount the like your experience as well, because like I think those unfortunately and fortunately, I don't know, however you want to picture it, those like weird imperial influences of Japan kind of linger on in all the different facets of our culture. I think you've mentioned before in another episode that your family's Hakka, right? So even like your experience is different than mine, and my family's like Thai speaking. Even with that, there's different mixes of the culture that get implemented into our family stories.
100%. And I wanted to ask you, because you mentioned obviously you came in with all this lore and this magical idea of Taiwan, but how was the expectation versus reality, especially on your first trip? And then like what about it made you decide like this is the place?
I think the first time I went, thankfully, like my older sister, I went with her, and like she was born in Taiwan, and like she had been so many different times throughout growing up. So she was kind of my guide the first time. I actually had never been to Taiwan with my mom until this last, how many months ago? 2 months ago. That was my first time actually getting to go with my mom. But I think because of that, there was this sense of like Taiwan was mine to experience for myself. I think a lot of people who grow up going with their families, like they see it within the context of what their family curates for them, right? The places that they decide to take you to go, and like the family meals that you have. But when I first got there for like my longer period, my first like 3-month bout, I got there and I just like started sobbing because I was like, what am I doing here? A lot of that reason was contextually, like I was a caretaker for both of my grandparents for the previous 2 years. And so like my whole life had revolved around like taking care of my akong and ama. And I think that until that point, like I didn't even know what I wanted for myself anymore. And so I think a big part of kind of reconnecting with myself and the things that I wanted in my life was going to Taiwan. But once I got there, I like put all my stuff down and I just started sobbing. I was like, what did I do? Why am I doing this? Like, who is this for? And it just felt so like disoriented. But I think that over the course of the 3 months, like it was a really beautiful journey of Taiwan truly embracing me and coming home to both myself and understanding that like I am Taiwanese-American. That will never ever change. I think Clarissa said it in a previous episode that you guys had, where like even more so for herself, she felt even more Taiwanese-American once she was in Taiwan. And I think I really felt that once I was in Taiwan, that like there's literally no way to separate this as part of my identity. Like this is a fact that I am Taiwanese American. There are like these huge culture gaps that I just clearly just do not understand what's going on, of like people my own age, what they like to do. Like I had to learn all those things for the first time. At one point, I remember I had an interaction because my Mandarin isn't as good as my Taiwanese. And I had an interaction with someone who was like talking to me in Mandarin, and they were like, oh, like I can tell that you're like the child of someone who immigrated to the US because the words you use are like very older person words to use. Like even my vocabulary was outdated, like even in Taiwanese too. They were like, oh, like I haven't heard that word in a really long time. Like we don't say it like that anymore. So I was like thinking like, oh, I'm out here saying like groovy or something in like a Taiwanese version of that, because like that's all I had heard growing up from my ama and akong and my mom and my dad. Like I was like, oh yeah, like I'm confident in Taiwanese. I can speak Taiwanese. And then they're like, something's off. Like where'd you get your vocab? Like you didn't get the system update. And I think for a long time I was really frustrated, where I was like, oh, like why can't I fit in? Why is it that I didn't know about this? Like I felt embarrassed like every single day for about 2 months continually missing things. I did not know what they were asking me to do because certain things is like a 载具, like the electronic app that you scan when you like do receipts. Like I was like, what is that? And like, you know, you have to get caught up. You literally have to get the software update of the however many decades that your family was not there. And at the same time, I was coming to a level of peace within myself of like, oh, this is like an irremovable part of myself that America has been, you know, Southern California, the Asian American Southern California experiences cannot be taken away from me. It's inextricably part of me. And so because of that, like, that's okay. I can be at peace with that in myself. And so therefore I can move around in the world, whether I'm here in the US or I'm in Taiwan, and I can be at peace that like I'm at home within myself. And so I do not need to seek a sense of home anywhere else. Like that will be part of me. And so my experience there, whether or not I get asked like, oh, aren't you Japanese? I get asked that all the time when I'm in Taiwan, like, wait, aren't you Japanese? Or if I'm here, they're like, you're Korean, right? Like, it doesn't matter because at least for myself, I gained this sense of like, oh, I'm at peace because I am who I am. That cannot be changed. So wherever I am, I will be okay.
That sounds amazing. We can all go home now. Like you answered the topic of the podcast, so we're just gonna
wrap it up. No, that's so amazing. It's very zen. I feel like you reached a very zen space within yourself that most people cannot reach. Like I had quite an identity crisis when I was abroad in Asia, and I think I'm starting to reach a similar point as you, but not as secure as you sound.
I think it's a journey. I don't know. It's a journey, and I think, to be honest, like a lot of it for me was getting to connect with Taiwanese-Americans who've moved back to Taiwan for longer periods of time. Like I met this woman, my friend Joanne, shout out to Joanne. She's from Southern California, she's from Arcadia, and she has lived in Taiwan with her family the last 14 years. All of her kids, she has 5 kids, they're all born and raised in Taiwan. And so there is this really interesting conversation that I had with people similar to her, Taiwanese-Americans, Taiwanese-Australians, Taiwanese-Europeans, who've all lived in various places but have now settled in Taiwan. And I think they helped guide me of what was normal to go through this experience of like, where am I? Who am I? Like system update is like malfunctioning. And I think they were just like, oh, it's okay. Like just go through the process. Like that's all normal. Like I would share with them like all my embarrassments and they'd be like, oh, that's normal. Like that's okay. And I think because of that, I was like, wow, like I felt like I had these like older sisters, older brothers who were like, you're fine. Like just live. Like it's fine. You don't need to be stuck in existential dread every single day. Like just enjoy the fact that you're living in Taiwan right now. What a blessing, what a joy to be here. Like just enjoy it. And I think that helped me be like, oh, okay, like I don't know what I don't know. That's fine. And so it's not like this, I've arrived at this like Zen place on my own. Like it really was like community helped bring me there and guide me there. And like, yeah, big shout out to my community in Taipei, especially because, I don't know where I'd be without them guiding me there.
That's so amazing. Can you talk a little bit more about how you found this community? Because I think for a lot of other American-born immigrant family folks, the idea of moving back to the motherland is scary to a lot of people because they're like, I vaguely have like some experience with it or have heard a lot about it. And like we all have some cultural understanding and language understanding because of our existing families. But the idea of like truly moving your whole life back to the motherland scares a lot of people because they feel like the culture clash or the language is just too much and it doesn't feel like they would have a community. So how did you find that community and like what words of encouragement would you give to other people who have an interest but are just kind of like scared to take that leap?
I think that like the first step is just like taking the first step, whatever that might be, looking out and seeing like, oh, what is out there for me, and kind of allowing yourself to be open, allowing your heart to have space for whatever it means with new community, new friends. But a lot of it for myself practically was like Facebook group searching mutual friends on Instagram or people reaching out on Instagram. I have a friend, Kathy, in Taipei. I feel like anyone who is Taiwanese diaspora knows Kathy. But she was such a huge connecting point for me because at that point I didn't really know anyone in Taipei other than like my family. And I was just like hang out with my cousins, hang out with my aunts and uncles. Like that's fine. But I was like, oh, I need friends to sustain myself here. If I actually want to build a like community, I can't just like be with aunts and uncles every day. Shout out to aunts and uncles though. I do love you. But I think like for myself, Kathy reaching out and being like, hey, I go to this International Journalist Association meeting in Taipei. Like, do you want to come? And I was like, oh, like, sure, I'm not a journalist though. And they're like, oh, but you wrote like one article before about the shooting that happened at the Taiwanese church in Irvine. A lot of us had read that article. Why don't you just come? I was like, okay. I remember I like got there an hour early because I was so nervous. I was like pacing. I was like, oh gosh, like new friends. And then I got there and got to meet all these new people and got connected to a lot of my friends that are now there too. But that was like the first of many events that I started going to. Another one is New Bloom Mag. Shout out to them as well. They do a lot of events. They're also English speaking. They do a lot of activism, youth activism work. They hold a lot of like workshops as well. And like little talks, they'll invite professors. Clarissa did a book launch there that I attended in Taipei when Made in Taiwan came out. So like there's all these gatherings, and then at each gathering you would find more gatherings. So it's like, oh, like, hey, I do like a poetry like gathering, like, do you want to join? And then also like I had friends who I had met in the US who are like Taiwanese nationals. They came here to the US to work, then they moved back to Taiwan, so I reconnected with them. And then they would introduce me to their friends. Again, like little by little, just like an open door for one opportunity opened up this like floodgate of like, oh, hey, there's like abundant community if you just look and if you're just open to it. There's a lot of Facebook groups as well. So even if you just like type in like Taiwanese-American Facebook group, a lot of people mention going back to Taipei or like, hey, I'm living in Taipei for a while. I want a friend. I think just being open to that, there's endless opportunities if you're just open.
That's awesome. I think it's a good reminder that finding community is work. It's like opening your heart, which is great because you can meet new people, but it's also work.
You've heard me complain about how weird it is to be an American-born Mandarin speaker because I grew up speaking Mandarin at home and have a passing native accent, but simultaneously sound like a child when trying to talk about real things. Since I realized no one out there was catering to people like us and decided, I'm just going to do it myself. I teamed up with my native Taiwanese Mandarin language teacher to create Real You Mandarin, a self-paced online Mandarin course built specifically for ABCs and ABTs. All of our content is video-based, realistic dialogues centered on topics you'd actually want to talk about, from dating and pop culture to media representation and growing up as a minority in a majority society. You'll learn the relevant vocabulary in the context you actually use them and be able to practice them daily with pre-built digital flashcards. You'll also be able to practice speaking by shadowing, repeating back, or following along with all of these dialogues to practice speaking at natural speed with the right pronunciations. Check out the course at realumandarin.com and get 10% off using promo code WhereAreYouFrom10. Let us help you express the real you when you speak Mandarin. Hey listeners, wondering how you can support us? The biggest way is by increasing our visibility by following us on Instagram at WhereAreYouFromPod, on TikTok at But Where Are You Really From, subscribing to our YouTube channel under But Where Are You Really From Podcast, rating and reviewing us on Apple Podcasts, and telling your friends. The more people we can get to listen to the show, the more we can continue spotlighting different perspectives and stories. And if you feel so inclined, we're also accepting donations at buymeacoffee.com/whereareyoufrom. Thanks y'all.
As you were meeting people, getting to know Taiwan better, who or how did you help yourself improve your language skills?
I would say my cousins helped me a lot. Like my cousins are all around my same age. My family is like ultra big. My ama has like 10 siblings. Half moved to the US, which is why I'm like, oh, most of my family's in the US, but it's just because it's so much family. Like our Thanksgiving gathering is going to be like well over 80 people. And then like in Taiwan, there's the other half, right? So like there's so much family everywhere and everyone is very close because they all grew up on this glorious dairy farm together. But yeah, I would say my cousins who are around my same age, they help me a lot. Having a space that is non-judgmental and safe for you to practice language is the key. Their English is okay. I think the average amount of like Taiwanese knowledge of English, which is like maybe written is like a lot better than speaking, but they understand a lot more than they can speak. I just would ask them all the time, what does that word mean? A lot, just constantly. And they were never annoyed with it. They would always be so patient and just be like, oh, it means this. And then they would use it in a sentence. Just give me opportunities to understand what the context of what they were saying. And I think also opening up the opportunity to deepen my relationship with them, where it was beyond like, oh, what do you do? Like, you know, after the first 2 months of me being there, we moved out of that like stage with my Taiwanese family where they were like, oh, Jocelyn, the guest is here. Like, let's prepare, like all this stuff. And now when I go back, they're like, oh, you're back again. and I think that is like actually so wonderful because I feel like I've witnessed them fighting or quarreling. Like I've witnessed the daily life of being with them. And because of that, the language skills that you pick up on, the more colloquial things that you pick up on, that was really helpful for me to be in an immersive environment where they weren't like trying to speak English to me when I tried to speak Mandarin to them, or if like I said something wrong, they wouldn't laugh at me. They would just be like, oh, do you mean this? And then I was like, oh, yes, that. And then they wouldn't like hound it into me, maybe like my mom would growing up. Oh, like you said it wrong. Like it's supposed to be like this. They would be like, oh, no, you're doing great. My cousin Mickey, Meichi, she would like constantly tell me every time we'd meet up, she'd be like, you're doing so much better than when you first moved here. And I was like, wait, really? Like, you really think so? And she was like, no, every time I meet you, every time I talk with you, there's an improvement. And I think that encouragement really meant so much to me because I was like, oh, I'm trying so hard. Mandarin is not as strong for me. I'm a lot stronger in Taiwanese. And for them, they would be like, you should teach me Taiwanese, or like, you should speak more Taiwanese to me. Or they would tell their friends like, oh, this is my American cousin. Like her Taiwanese is so much better than ours. And I think that even was encouraging for me of like, okay, like I'm okay. I'm just learning. I'm not stupid. They wouldn't talk down to me like a child. They would want to have high-level emotional conversations with me about life and psychology and how to get along with your coworkers when there's a lot of drama at work, like normal things you would talk to a friend with. And they would be willing to engage with that with me. And that mixed with, again, also my Taiwanese friends being willing to, again, be patient, be safe, be willing to explain when I would ask, like, what does that mean? Like, I don't know. Can you say it again? Can you say it again? One more time, like use it in a sentence. But for those who maybe don't have that outlet, there also is a lot of like language exchange programs. A lot of locals will do like, oh, let's do like our lunch session language exchange where you can just meet up with them, eat lunch with them, eat a meal with them, speak Chinese with them. And it's like just dialogue. But I think that type of immersion and practice is really helpful for improving.
It's so amazing that you have such a wonderful support group to help you with that, because I do feel a lot of what you described of like initially it can feel like embarrassing or kind of like, oh, am I stupid because I don't know these things? But I think for a lot of us American born people who go back to the motherland, that's like an initial reaction a lot of us have because we grew up speaking at least one of the mother languages, many of us. So we think like, oh, we're intelligent, adult beings. And then you go back and you're like, why do I feel so stupid? And I think having grace for yourself is so important because keeping in mind the context of like, we did not grow up there. So it's just like impossible for us to have the adult vocabulary and the cultural understanding to be able to have all these conversations without immersing yourself. So I'm so happy to hear that you are getting better every day and having all these opportunities to kind of do that system update that you were talking about and to understand and forgive yourself of like, yeah, I'm on a learning journey, which is normal. I'm not from here actually, So I definitely vibe with your whole story. And I hope that other people who are thinking about doing a similar journey have that same grace for yourself because you're not stupid. You have just like, we didn't grow up there. And that's just a fact. And also, I think you mentioned before, like really embracing your Taiwanese-American identity. And I really strongly believe in that, especially myself after having lived in Asia myself for the last year or so. I told Jesse in a previous episode, but I have never felt as American, honestly, until I was living in Asia. A lot of times in the US, we tend to question, like, am I that American? Because we have other things going on in the US context that make us question the identity. But when you go abroad and you try to immerse yourself in especially like your motherland, you realize, oh, I'm quite American because the cultural understanding that I have, the way that I see the world is so different from like my family and friends that live here. And that's a good thing. And it's also something that like you shouldn't be ashamed of, because I think for me, when I go back to Taiwan, at least the initial times as an adult, I always had this kind of like shame around being American, because I felt like, oh, I'm not like native enough for my family or to pass in society, like Taiwanese society, without them calling me out for saying something weird or like sounding American or whatever. But the fact of the matter is we are not native Taiwanese people, and that's okay. And especially for people like you that are trying to live more permanently in the motherland, I think then people understand that context better too, where it's like, oh, you're trying to like immerse in a totally different society than you grew up in. So it's actually quite brave and like quite an arduous task to take on like a new culture and to try to improve your language to the level that people exist with there. And they're more willing to help you as well. I noticed that too with my own Japanese. My Japanese is not at the same level as I think your Mandarin would be for Taiwan, but I'm trying to learn more and more every day. And I've noticed the same kind of helpful energy from my community in Japan, which is like, you're not Japanese, so of course your Japanese is not like native level. Let me explain to you why this thing didn't make sense, or let me explain to you like the more normal way of saying something. And don't be afraid to ask. That's been something that held myself back in a lot of ways with language, is I like always had a fear of sounding stupid, of asking something that would sound stupid, like what is that really simple thing that everybody knows means. Like I'd be afraid to ask, but it's just the only way to learn, right? And so yeah, sorry, I went on a little rant here, but I vibe so much with your story.
No, I think that's so awesome that, like, again, even in your Japanese journey, like, it makes even more sense why I'm going to plug your Mandarin course now too, because for those who can't just like go to Taiwan and immerse yourself for however many months, there's also this course that was designed for ABCs, that to be able to expand your vocabulary. I'm sure that you plugged it in the past, but everyone's journey is their own. And I think knowing that, like, hey, you're not stupid, hey, it's okay to learn, and just having the humility to be like, it's okay, I don't know what I don't know, and I'm on a journey to be curious and to be a sponge and learn. And that's all the mindset that you really need, because in a lot of senses, like, the biggest barrier is often ourselves, our own shame, our own area of self-doubt. Once you are able to meet each time shame comes up with like, hey, it's okay, you're safe, you can keep going, that is a really pivotal like next step that you can take in your language journey. So I love that you plugged your own language journey.
Thank you. Well, let's pivot, because we want to give a lot of spotlight to your book. And we talked about your now two kind of different cultures coming together. So I feel like that obviously must have a big role in everything that went into writing this book. So let's talk about When Love is More Than Words. What was the inspiration for wanting to write this book? And also, like, how did you get this opportunity? Because not everyone gets the opportunity to write their own book. So let's talk about all that.
Wow, this journey honestly in some ways feels very accidental. Like, I feel like I fell into it. I had been writing kind of openly on Instagram. I had been treating my Instagram page as kind of like an open journal of like my own process of legacy and identity mixed in with like lettering and design. One day during the pandemic, like, this agent reached out to me in my DMs and was like, hey, like, I've been following you for a while. Did you know you're a writer? Like, have you ever thought about like writing a book one day? I don't know why I'm doing this. She probably was like this because it's on her phone. For those listening, I was typing like I'm on a keyboard. Now I'm on my phone. And then I replied like, oh, like, no, I didn't know I was a writer, but thank you. Like, that's really nice of you. And she was like, would you like to hear about the publishing process? Like, I could just like lay it out for you and you can like just keep it in the back of your mind. And I was like, sure, why not? And around the same time, an editor actually from Penguin Random House had also reached out to me and was like, hey, like, I've been following you for a while, kind of the same thing. Did you know that you're a writer? Do you have any manuscripts by chance that like you'd be interested in sharing? And at that time I didn't have anything, but she also offered to meet over Zoom and just like kind of lay out the process for me. She also was Asian American, so she also voiced like, hey, there's a need for like more Asian American stories to be told as well. And so I just kind of kept that in the back of my mind. mind and was like, great, like, I don't know when I'm going to use this. Like, I haven't thought about writing in a professional sense, but sure, this is great information just to know. And so fast forward like a full year, literally a full calendar year, that's just like ruminating in the back of my mind. I'm continuing to write as I do. And again, during this time, I was a caretaker for my grandparents. This is now like exactly 3 years ago, in 2021. And I was taking care of my akong who was diagnosed with cancer. And I was in the hospital with him one day, and I had brought like watermelon and blueberries and brought my iPad so he could watch old tennis matches, like reruns. And I was just sitting with him in the hospital for several hours. I was like journaling and doodling, and he was watching the match. And I think in that moment, I was like, wow, we are like in a extremely sterile environment, like beeping, that hospital smell that has become, at that point, was so familiar to me. We had been in and out of the hospital so much. And yet, like in this very sterile environment, no words are being said, but like there is an abundant well of love present in this room. And so in that moment, I was like, oh, there's like a story that I want to share. And I pulled up like this old poem I had written a long time ago about like, oh, I am from all of these different things that make up who I am. And a lot of it talked about legacy. A lot of it talked about my family's like lore of Taiwan, and like the love that I had experienced. And so I just started writing out like when love is more than words, and started going through like my family tree. And that night when I went home, I had finished what is now pretty much the exact manuscript that you read. Like there's been rounds of edits, but the structure, the story is pretty much the same, like other than like grammatical and like, you know, certain words being switched out so that kids can understand it more. And so then I reached back out to both the editor and the author, like, hey, remember me? It's been a year. Hope you're doing well. Like, I don't know if that offer is still on the table, but like, I think I have something now. And I remember my agent who currently represents me, Chris, she was like, I've been waiting for this day. And she was like, let's hop on a call. And then the journey kind of took off. It was, we put together this manuscript. There's like all these steps that you have to do to like put together a package basically that gets sent out to publishers. And then it got sent out via my agent to all these different publishers. And then we had 5 different publishers come back and be like, hey, we want to buy your book. So then there was like a bidding war that happened. And then I ended up going with Nancy Paulson Books of Penguin Random House. So again, like it all feels very like accidental in some way, but also it happened just as it needed to. And I didn't like grow up dreaming of writing kids' books. Like it just was something that happened organically from this experience that I had being in the hospital with my akong. And now I'm here. And now this book is out in the world.
Girl, I am not exaggerating. I got chills when you told the story of the hospital and you like getting inspired for writing, just writing that there is a story around this. I still kind of have chills around it. It's so lovely. Because I think, you know, I didn't know what your inspiration was behind it, but I think a lot of times when people think of a book or some work of art, especially one that is sold, when you ask like, what's the inspiration behind it? A lot of times like, there's this goal and then I had to reach this goal. But for you, it was so organic that this story existed between your relationship with your own grandfather already, and you kind of felt compelled to write it. That's so different, I think, than a lot of other things you might hear out there. So that, yeah, I'm still like, so lovely. I mean, we both read the book, and I definitely resonated so much with the message throughout of just like, there's so many different ways that you can feel love and express love besides saying, I love you. And at least for me, I feel like it's such an important message to give to kids, because if I had read something like this as a kid growing up, I think maybe I wouldn't have as many like childhood trauma issues. No, not really. But I feel like we've talked about, you know, having some challenges growing up because we felt like we didn't know if our parents loved us, or because in American culture, our American friends always heard their moms and dads just tell them explicitly, like, I love you, and like excessive hugs and all that and kisses. And that's not always the way that Asian families engage with each other. So if I had read something like this, where it's like, look at all these different reflections, especially acts of service, which is something that a lot of Asian culture defaults to, that are ways to show that you love somebody. Like maybe I would have had more confidence in the fact that my family does love me. So yeah, I don't know. It's a beautiful book. And I'm so happy that you wrote it and that it's going to be shared with other kids who are growing up in similar cultures and hopefully have a little bit more confidence in the love that does already exist within their families.
Thank you. Like you literally voiced exactly what I was hoping. So that is literally my hope in this book. All of those things I resonate with. Same experience, white friends, like just witnessing their parents always be like, "I love you so much, honey, mwah, mwah, mwah." And then I would be like, "Whoa, that's a lot." And then I'd be like, why don't my parents do that? And I'd be like, why doesn't she do that? And I'd have so much resentment or like bitterness towards like, oh, why didn't you express it like this? And I think my hope is, again, that like kids would be able to kind of put on those glasses to be able to see around them like, oh, like I'm surrounded by love in many, many different ways. And it doesn't have to just look like one certain type of love. It's like all these different ways. It almost becomes this like search, I guess, like to look around you like, wow, how many different ways am I surrounded by love in my community, in my family, my extended family? So I am very happy to hear that that was your experience of the book. And I hope so much that like families will be able to read this together and that would be what they take away from the book of like, wow, I'm surrounded by love in so many different ways. Even if they're not Asian American, even if they're not Asian, like just that they would understand like, oh, love comes in so many different forms. And that is like a really beautiful thing.
It's amazing. It definitely tugs at a heartstring. I mean, like you see all the different acts of service that I think we all learn to recognize, but maybe have a really hard time reconciling for a really long part of like childhood and like early adulthood. But I think when you started the process, this wasn't originally going to be a children's book. So when you wrote that initial manuscript after that experience with your grandfather, did you have someone in mind that you wanted to share with, like a specific audience, or is just something that you felt like you had to put together for catharsis or like just commemorating that moment?
Oh, it was 100% catharsis. Like, I have so many, maybe it's being a creative and like a naturally very emotional person, but I have like a whole folder that's just like catharsis and it's just commemorating or absorbing like whatever feelings it is that I have in a certain moment. I just would like throw them in there and just like kind of forget about it. But I think for the process of writing this, like I didn't really have an audience per se. Like it was very cathartic. And then I was like, oh yeah, I forgot about that agent that had reached out to me, that editor who had reached out to me. So it suddenly was like, oh yeah, I guess I could bring this to them. Like there's something special in this writing that feels a little bit different. Like the quality of it feels a little different than things that I wrote just for cathartic dump. But I think that the big thing that needed to be changed in the manuscript was like a lot of the words that I used were a little bit too advanced for maybe someone in like early childhood preschool to be able to understand. Like I remember I used the word sacrifice in the first iteration of the book. And like a lot of like not as concrete examples. It was a lot of like, Jijie helps me when I don't believe in myself and I feel a lot of self-doubt. Like I guess as part of the publishing process, which I didn't know, is like a lot of this, they are just thinking constantly like, what does the kid understand? What does the kid understand? And even something like sacrifice, I was like, oh yeah, like shouldn't that concept be understood? Like that should be okay. And they'd be like, what does sacrifice look like? The question that would be turned on me whenever an edit would come through would be like, so what does this look like concretely? What does self-doubt look like? Like what does like speaking encouragement look like? Like, cause that writing out speaking encouragement, like a child who's 3 might not know like, what does encouragement mean? Like it's such a long word, such an abstract word. So they just kept telling me over and over again, make it concrete, make it concrete. At the time, it was frustrating because I wanted to have this more poetic prose, I guess, to a poetic feel of the book. But I don't think that that was lost in the manuscript. Like it still keeps this poetic quality, but I think it has this just more grounded feel to it because it is more rooted in like the actual action that is experienced by the child who's observing around them. And I think that was a big change that really helped get the book to the place where it was then intended for an actual audience and not just my cathartic dump in my folder, my computer.
Awesome. I feel like all good pieces of art are temporal in a sense, and I love that this is just almost in a way just for us. In a way it is. I think anyone who is coming from a family that immigrates somewhere with that background and culture can experience what you've documented in the book in their own ways, but it's always just going to be for us.
I actually feel like there's a recurring theme in this book and a lot of the other things that we've talked about on the show before. So we said a similar thing with Clarissa about Made in Taiwan, about like who is this book for, right? And we also came to a similar conclusion of kind of like it's for like everyone. It's for everyone, technically, but if you are Taiwanese-American, there's just like the special little extra that you get with it. And that's what I felt reading your book as well, especially with the illustration, which we do want to talk about, because you also mentioned like it's not just for Taiwanese-Americans, but for sure, I see a lot of like immigrant families, especially I think food is just like such a universal theme amongst especially immigrant families of like how to show love. So I think it's going to resonate with so many different types of people, but there's so much about like the specific examples you give of the specific acts of service matched with the illustration that I'm like, oh my God, this is my childhood. This is like exactly what I grew up with, that it would hit just like this extra little factor. And similarly, we love Everything Everywhere All at Once. I'm constantly talking about that movie, but one of the main reasons we loved it is like you can relate to the story even if you're not of Chinese or Taiwanese background, because it's not about being Chinese. It just happens that they are Chinese, but you can relate on a human level. And then if you happen to have some sort of Chinese or Taiwanese background, then you're like, oh, I like get it a little bit more. So for sure, your book had that same message for me when I read it. I was like, everyone's going to love it no matter what their background is. But if you get it, you get it.
Yeah, that's definitely like was my intention, was like, I wrote this for us. Of course it's for everyone. Like, of course it is for whatever like levels of identity, for immigrant families, for Asian America, like immigrant families, like whatever it might be. It is for everyone. Yet also like the hidden like heart message is like, oh, this is for Taiwanese Americans. Part of that was actually a lot of the struggle of the editing process for me, was that like throughout the editing process, a lot of certain things almost got fully taken out of the book by my editors. I had to like really advocate for like, no, this needs to stay in here. The cut fruit almost got taken out, and I had to literally type out like an essay of like, do not take this out. And I'm going to link all these articles for why cut fruit is a love language of Asian cultures. And I was like, copy paste. And I was like, write out a whole essay and like, do not take it out, send. And that kept happening, where it was like, even the foods that were chosen, they were like, that doesn't seem very comforting. And I'd be like, well, maybe not for you, but actually for me, this is very comforting. And a lot of this was the reality that publishing is still a very white world. Yes, a lot has happened and changed in the last like 6 years, especially, I would say. Like a lot of changes have happened. But in general, publishing is still very white, and publishing is still about making money. And so the idea and the goal behind it still is often publishers and editors are thinking like, what will make money, what will sell to the most amount of people possible. And for me, I was like, no, the heart of this is like Taiwanese Americans. Like, no, this is for them. And thank you for plugging the art, because Julia Kuo, my lovely illustrator and friend, is just amazing. Like I had written like a few notes in my manuscript of like, oh, I picture this like this, but she really just took it and ran with it. And I trusted her completely, because again, she's also Taiwanese American. When I like got back with the first like rounds of her sketches and stuff, my only thing that I wrote back was just keep going. Like, just keep going. I don't have any edits. Like, just do what you're doing. Because she put all these like Taiwanese Easter eggs like all throughout the book, whether it's like in the corner, there's like a frame that has like a Taiwan map on it. There's like a cardboard like Yiling Yi, like Taipei 101 in the corner. The kitchen, like it's a Zojurishi like water heater. Like, of course it's that one. Like, I don't know how else to explain it. Of course it's that one, as opposed to a different water heater. Like, of course it's a datong in the background, datong dianguo, instead of like, I don't know, a rice cooker that is like more, I don't know, bulky and looks cool and like futuristic. It had to be specific. And I think the beauty of entrusting it to someone as wonderful and talented and who treasured the story as much as Julia did, was that she just took it and she was like, I know this story because it's my story. And she just took it and like placed all of her love and added all of these little Easter eggs that, like, again, it's for everyone, but you just get this extra like heart for those who get it, and those who will be like, oh my gosh, like that's that, or oh, that fruit, like the mango is cut that way, of course it's cut this way, like I don't know how else to explain it. Like, it just has to be cut like this, where it folds out and you eat it like in cubes and you eat it off the peel. I don't know how else to say it, but that's just what needed to happen. And I love that Julia incorporated like holongguo and like lambu, like all these very Taiwanese fruits that needed to be in there, but didn't need to, but because she did, like it just felt so right, because it was for us. So again, it's that extra like sprinkle on top that is like, it is for everyone, but like it is an extra love letter to Taiwanese Americans especially.
For sure. I loved the illustration, and you're right, it's full of Easter eggs. I was just like, oh, I didn't know this before, and there's like all these little things. And actually one little thing I loved at the end, I was like, okay, this is even more dialed in. So I was like, this is for SoCal,
The roof.
SoCal Taiwanese American. The roof. The house at the end. I'm like, that's every house in Southern California.
That red roof with those curved tiles, yeah. That is totally Julia, because she lives in Seattle. Like she added that, and when I like saw it, I told her, I was like, that is my roof. Like that is literally the roof that's on top of my house, like at home. That was such a deep cut, but it was so special that she integrated that. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, I think we are right around the right spot to transition to close. So we wanted to ask you, obviously your book already lays out all the different ways that your family has shown you love throughout your life, but what is your favorite way that your family has shown you love in a quote unquote untraditional way? It could be just like one special memory you had, or like a recurring way that one of your family members shows you love, but something that people might not think is like, oh, that is love.
Okay, when you first asked that, like I was hit with like, whoa, that's a really big question. But actually something did come to mind. I was actually talking about it with my therapist this last week, which was, I think, the fruit growing, for many reasons. Because one, like it is the legacy of my family as farmers that has continued on in Southern California. Like some of that fruit was smuggled from Taiwan and brought over in suitcases back when that was okay. And they planted it and it just kept growing, right? And kept bearing fruit, kept feeding us, kept nourishing us. And there is this like reverence for the garden that has been like generational, that like whatever is grown in the garden, my atzo, my great grandma, who's mentioned in the book, like she literally would sit there for hours just peeling lima beans. Hours. And these lima beans are like little potatoes. Like they're not really like all that special, but growing up, it was like, oh, these are Atsol's lima beans. So we were always told like, oh, we have to eat every single one, like, and enjoy it like so much because Atsol peeled these just for us. And even now, like my mom just moved into my akong and ama's house since they have since passed. And like we are in their garden every day. And even when we're in the garden, like the holongguo is still, it's harvest season right now. It's like bursting at the seams with so much red and white dragon fruit. Our shikia cherimoya tree is also blooming. Like the fruit keeps giving. And that is a beautiful legacy of love that has been passed down to me. But just the remembrance that like every time I eat a fruit, like I have a dragon fruit to eat after this, I will remember like, okay, this is their love that like nourished this plant into fruition, and they're not here anymore, but like it's literally still nourishing my being and bringing me joy as I eat it. And so that for me is, I think, the most special way that I experience non-traditional love.
More chills
so beautiful.
and more chills. So symbolic. Well, y'all, if you want to see what we've been talking about this whole time, When Love is More Than Words is available now. Jocelyn, let folks know, where can they find it? Or is there like a special bookstore you like to plug? Anything like that?
Wow. You can find it pretty much everywhere. It's on Amazon, it's on Barnes & Noble, but also with bookshop.org because you can buy directly from a lot of local booksellers. I am directing most of mine to Bel Canto Books in Long Beach. They are an Asian American owned bookshop in downtown Long Beach. And so I would plug them in particular, but you can find it pretty much everywhere. And then internationally, I believe it will be in like Eslite later on in Taiwan. And also I've seen some Canadian, Japanese, and Australian sellers online too. So I will update into the future and you can follow me to figure out where those links will be for international buyers. But other than that, you should be able to find it pretty much anywhere.
Yay, Esley, fancy. And where can people find you if they want to follow along? Because you do have so much that you share with the world. So what's your Instagram handle or website or whatever you want to let people know where to follow you at?
My Instagram is Jocelyn S. Chung, so at Jocelyn S. Chung. I'm also the same handle on Twitter, though I'm not as active on there anymore. And also my website, jocelynchung.com. You can find my design work, and also we'll be updating with more book things in the future. But that's where you can find me.
Yay! Well, thank you so much for joining us. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah, I had so much. Thanks for having me. This was just a joy. Yeah.
Amazing.
We had so much fun with you. And we truly wish you so much success with the book. We're really excited to see the reaction that people have and the reception from the audience. So yay! Congratulations again.
Thank you.
And listeners, let us know what you think about this episode. And if you had a chance to check out the book yet, if any of you have been following Jocelyn and know about this book, have some things to let us know, drop it in the comments of wherever you're currently consuming this episode. We'd love to engage in dialogue with you. Maybe Jocelyn will jump into the comments as well. And come back next week because we will have another fresh episode for you then. And until then,
Bye, bitches.